This segment is called Being a Boss, and here we go. It's going to be a multi-show segment. We're going to do a bunch of things. I'm only going to do a couple of pages of this. We're running short on time, but actually maybe I'll just do the whole thing, and maybe you guys will get a little extra show in. We talk a lot on this show about several different bosses. Each have their strengths, each have their weaknesses, and we often discuss the climate that they're in, which can lead to indictments and more. But if we look at some bosses, at least historically, we can see the pathway for success. This segment is all about how to function as a boss, how to avail yourself the chance to stay the fuck away from indictments. And what is factual is that no matter how you throw the dice, it's coming up snake eyes if there's a rat in the fold. That's just the truth. But there are some things that you can do to stop that dead in its tracks. Lucky Luciano, for example, was feared. He was a determined guy. But it didn't stop, the brothel hose from dropping his name, which led to his pandering charge, which would lead him to getting kicked out of the country ultimately. It also didn't help that Luciano had Vito Genovese not wanting to take a backseat to anybody and playing the game behind the scenes. In fact, I largely suspect once Luciano was tossed out of the country and he attempted to make his base of operations in Cuba, it would have probably worked out well, or at least long enough, so that down the line, once Dewey was no longer relevant, he could have used another source within the federal government to get back into the country. But he died before he could ever get that chance. Genovese knew politics, and he knew that Cuba relied on the United States for much needed medication. And he knew that Cuba couldn't afford to lose that. So once he dropped a dime, he knew it was just a matter of time. The question becomes, did Luciano underestimate Vito Genovese? And I think he did. I don't have a problem saying that. Granted, that scenario was a little bit wide in scope, to say the least. But if we think about it, if Luciano acts prior to the attempted hit on Frank Costello in 1957, a lot changes. Costello continues on as boss. They continue to keep their political power. Appalachian never happens. So this segment is going to be a lot of different things with historical points of view for reference. Because history is always the best example to use. Not everything is perfect in the underworld, and sometimes guys neglect to defend themselves to keep the peace. And I totally understand that. But at the same time, imagine Luciano acted if he had acted differently. A lot of changes happened to the mafia because of that. These are the tenets that are the most important, in my opinion, that we're going to discuss. Every mob group, every criminal group has to evolve. And while new and old surveillance tactics have changed throughout the years, you can still be silent when you need to be. But what we have seen over the last 30 years or so in the mob in many ways is they've hurt themselves more than the federal government ever could have. And there are a few things that a boss has to have. Number one, you have got to be feared. Albert Anastasia didn't get to where he got by being easy on people. Now, historically, Albert Anastasia was in full control of the Italian side of Murder Incorporated. And he wasn't picked for that role because he came with a smirk and fucking lollipops. He had no indifference to murder, life, or death. He didn't give a shit. To him, it was just easy. It was like wiping your nose. In 1928, Albert Anastasia made a witness against him disappear. At the time, he was head of the ILA, controlling 6 chapters of the union in Brooklyn alone. His reputation was one whereby if you step sideways, he would kill you without hesitation. No second chances. This helped him because in 1932, he was indicted for murdering a man with an ice pick, but no witnesses would come forward because they were terrified of him. Then in 1933, the same thing happens. He whacks somebody else, and no witnesses would go near it. Albert Anastasia established from that moment that death was the price to pay for not looking the other direction and minding your fucking business. And this was prior to Murder Incorporated. By 1951, Anastasia had his sights set on being the boss of the Mangano crime family. He didn't settle for just being the underboss. The rub on Mangano and Anastasia was that Mangano feared the power that Anastasia was gaining. And he especially didn't like the friendship that Anastasia had with Luciano and Costello. So on April 19th of 1951, Anastasia finds himself the new boss of the Mangano crime family. And the reason why is because he killed fucking Mangano and he killed his fucking brother. Anastasia then lies to the commission and he explains to them Mangano was likely going to kill him. So if there was any reaction, it would be preemptive and that would be justified, but he didn't kill him. Can you imagine putting yourself in that situation? He was going to kill me, and so if anything was preemptive, it would have been justified, but it wasn't me. Could you see the look on some of their faces? Like, what, did he really just say that? But that's really how it went down. Fear is a big thing. The power of fear is knowing you cannot talk yourself out of a situation. You think Roy DeMeo could have survived without fear? No. Had it not been for his crew, someone might have popped off and called him a fat fuck and challenged him. But his zero tolerance policy kept people in line. With Anastasia, once he overtook the role as boss, he began to peel back the layers. And while he was still feared, he also became blinded by his own power, which we will talk about later. Vincent the Gigante had a policy. If you even spoke his fucking name, he would kill you. If you look at all the wiretaps in existence, there are almost zero of anyone within the Genovese crime family figuring Vinny Gigante as the boss. Almost zero. Even when Tony Salerno got indicted for being the boss of the family, even though the government and the entire mafia knew Vinny the Chin was the boss, nobody said otherwise. If you look at wiretaps of the Gambinos, there are some 36 fucking tapes with Gotti's own crew and own men bashing the shit out of him, complaining about him. And then there's him talking about himself and other people. There was no fear. Fear is an end to justify the means. Niccolo Machiavelli in The Prince discusses the idea of whether it is better to be loved or feared. And scholars for hundreds of years have debated that statement. Many have opined that fear lasts longer than love. And there may be some half-truth to that. But the point Machiavelli is making, and this is going to be a lot of Machiavellian shit, so I hope you guys are prepared for that. The point that Machiavelli is making is that a ruler has to decide which one he wants to be. Machiavelli's stance was that a ruler should be both if he can actually do that. A ruler or a leader or a boss that is loved is only effective while that love can lead to personal gain for the men. The second ruler's power begins to fade, they get abandoned. Fear, on the other hand, is uncertain, and it keeps your men loyal, and it keeps them obedient, even in difficult situations. And here's the difficult situation for you to think about, to apply this to: the Paul Castellano murder. In other words, a boss who wants to be loved is not enough. You can be respected, but also be feared. And both of those things are a good thing to have. But I honestly believe that being feared creates more respect. And if I had to choose one vice, it's to be feared. Control is key. And to be a good boss, you have to be able to create fear. You cannot be the boss who's wishy-washy with people. You have, your men have to know where you stand. Not just leave it to somebody to guess. They have to know. Bosses who leave men to guess face revolt. Joe Bonanno wasn't feared. Joe Bonanno left his own men to fend for themselves in a war that he essentially created. He barked orders from Arizona while his men were being killed in the fucking streets. That created malcontent. It created internal problems. Joe Bonanno forgot the tenet: your men must fear you. Hell, his men didn't even love him. He got neither one of those. But if they did, believe me, Joe Bonanno would have shit on Carlo Gambino's lap and they would have gone to war with Bonanno and fought anybody. But he didn't have that. Number two, the men you surround yourself with determine everything. You ever heard the saying, well, to judge somebody, I look at who they hang out with. This is basically saying the same thing, but this is on sort of a different scale. You don't have to have like-minded men, but you also sort of need everybody to be on the same page. It's not to say that everybody has to be down with the fucking 401k, but universally speaking, the men you surround yourself with must be content. They must have the same ideals. You want your hierarchy to have a lot of things. They have to be the voice when you're away. They have to be your conscience on the street in many ways. Without a powerful wall, you've heard me talk about Philadelphia before. Without a powerful wall, even the laziest of slobs will scale the fence or the wall if your men are not paying attention. The best method for understanding the intelligence of any boss is to look at the men that he surrounds himself with. Some people, I think, lose the idea. Some people, I think, lose what the idea here is about the hierarchy in general. The underboss, the consigliere, they have to protect the boss. In fact, if we go back to feudal Sicily, if we go back to the origins of the mafia, the whole basis is to insulate the boss. What I think we've seen, especially since the late 1980s, is that not all families, but we've seen the change, the rank and file has changed. In Italy, in many cases, people don't know who the fucking boss is. And I don't understand why any mafia fucking tradition or not, why they need to introduce who the fucking captains are, who the boss is at an induction ceremony. Everybody knows who the fuck everybody is. In many cases, especially here in the United States, everybody knows who everybody is. When it comes to the induction ceremony, they don't need to explain who's who. And we're going to talk about that in depth later on in this series. If we look at bosses like Vinny Gigante, Tony Accardo, Joey Merlino, Carlo Gambino, they surround themselves with men who had desire, but never too much that it would lead them down the lane to take a run at the top. In the case of Joey Merlino, it's probably the best example in the history of the mafia, where the boss is truly insulated from law enforcement in the eyes and ears because of the hierarchy. Name me another boss, other than, say, Carlo Gambino, Ray Patriarca, a couple other people, and Vinny Gigante, who has had that ability. Name me one. Vicamuso? Tony Ducks? Do I need to keep going? You will struggle to name me another boss that's been able to do that. So when we discuss politics, especially when we discuss politics or the art of politicking, you have to be able to bend. You have to be able to give. But you also have to not put yourself in the grip of another family. Some of the greatest politicians would have had long runs as the leaders of the mafia had they had men around them to, one, protect them, two, who had like-minded ideas. Frank Costello was probably one of the mob's best politicians ever in the history of organized crime. He could mend fences in cool waters. Raymond Patriarca was the same way. And he often was brought in to settle disputes between other families because argumentative factions knew that Ray Patriarca, if not beside anything else, was fair. You have to understand money is not always the most important derivative here. Sometimes it's just about standing up and being counted. So a natural leader absolutely must put like-minded men beside him. If we look at Joe Bonanno, if he did this the right way, and he kind of did, he backed Carmine Galante, as they both had like-minded ideas. Galante was loyal to Bonanno like crazy. The problem was Bonanno had no way of keeping Galante in control because Galante didn't fear Bonanno. And the second you open the door to the corral, the blind eye, the roosters are going to play. Number 3, you don't have to be seen or heard to make a point, but you must make a point. Vincent Gigante didn't play the apeshit game because he was bored. He had nothing better to do than act fucking Looney Tunes. He did it to insulate himself from law enforcement. He allowed his manhood to take a beating to save his family and for his operations and his rackets. John Gotti, on more than one occasion, made fun of Eddie the Chin behind his back, claiming that no man should ever demean themselves so low that he acts like a fucking nut on the street. While Gotti transversely was actually an egotist, and he needed to be seen and fawned over, Gigante was the complete opposite of John Gotti. He knew in order for business to keep going, he needed to do what he needed to do. Many people have called him weak for that, but I truly think it's one of the most shrewd moves we've ever seen in organized crime history. Gambino's fake heart attacks are nothing in comparison to the 25-year nut act that Gigante pulled on the feds. I think it's hilarious. Gigante was more powerful than John Gotti, but he was smart enough and conniving enough to allow John Gotti to believe that John Gotti was in control of the whole entire mafia. It was a move designed to let Gotti take the shine and then take all the fucking heat. And the Genovese crime family would just reap all the rewards when the Gambinos were decimated. And that's exactly what the fuck they did. Bosses do not need to be physically seen. They do need, however, need to be heard at times. Joey Massino, fucking rat. But he did two things in the history of his life that, despite the end result of him being a fat rat piece of shit, he did two things that were really smart, which would appear to be common sense to most of us. The first thing he did was he put a ban on all social clubs within his family. No more social clubs. And then he asked other bosses in the mafia to join that decision. He knew they were essentially planting a flag every week in one fucking spot. He knew it would only take the feds so long to install a bug, or if an informant poached into the club, it was over for everybody. Why other bosses needed to facilitate that is beyond my understanding. The best example was John Gotti every fucking Tuesday night. Everybody meet here. We got to talk. He just didn't give a fuck about the feds. And if he had just pulled back on the reins just a little bit, the feds would have had a harder time getting to him. That's just the truth. He made them determined, and he made it easy for them. Joe Massino also banned captains from meeting in public or about anything. And so this kind of needs a little explanation. You know, as you know, there's a hierarchy to every family, right? Oftentimes a family will use a front boss structure, and that was invented by the Genovese crime family, and they still use that today. Joey Massino said one time, one of us is out, nobody cares. But when there's two of us, there's a fucking conspiracy. And he's right. If you're out by yourself walking your dog, fine. You meet with Joey Pipes down in the corner, all of a sudden it's a fucking conspiracy. He knew that if the captains met out in the open, it was bad for business, bad for the family. He banned his captains from meeting publicly and banned them from meeting with other captains from other families publicly. Where there is a connection, there is a conspiracy. And do not fucking forget that. Bosses don't need to be seen, albeit consistently. But let's look at two situations where the bosses did that and it came back to bite them in the ass. Joe Bonanno took off to Arizona while his own men were shooting in the streets. He spent more time out west than back east, and it presented a lot of issues. And that pretty much ruined his career in the mafia. Bonanno could have had a revival of sorts in the 1960s had he just been available to his men. He wasn't, and that eventually turned on him. And it was chaotic for the next 20 years because of that. That's how it started. Paul Castellano. Paul, prior to becoming boss, wasn't a guy seen a whole lot. He began in the streets with a gun in his hand. He was a tough guy. Don't get it fooled. Paul Castellano was a dangerous guy. He was a tough guy. He was a shooter. People forget that. But as he aged and as he rose in rank, he began to legitimize himself in other ways. And Carlo Gambino recognized that in him. The Gambinos were transforming by 1972, and they were moving wide open into the construction rackets, and Carlo saw the family moving in a direction where there were more opportunities for legitimacy. Castellano had a lot of money tied up in legitimate deals, as we know, and whereas his ascension to the throne is a natural succession, I think Paul forgot about the streets. He was in a time and a place where he didn't, need or want to hang out with the neighborhood guys anymore. And that's how Carlo was as well. But Carlo would meet with men at a coffee shop right down the street from here. Carlo, for the most part, stayed away from the majority of it, and he closed the books on making guys for almost, 20 years, 30 years, 20 years, whatever the fuck it was, because he feared the younger men. He feared that they truly did not understand Cosa Nostra. They were almost too Americanized for him, and out for their own success and not out for the success of the family. Carlo knew a lot of shit, and he was right about a lot of shit. He saw a lot of things coming down the pike. When Carlo passes away and Paul is named boss, he would become the most powerful gangster in the United States. The one thing Paul does is isolate himself from everybody. Now, granted, he took meetings on Tot Hill and Staten Island on Sundays, but it's a situation where his ego got in the way of his own decision-making. Guys never saw him. Instead, in many ways, Paul was the king of the hill, and nobody could have a conversation with him about anything. And while it was helpful because it did isolate him from informants, the other issue it created was big beefs within the family itself. Paul was definitely heard but not seen. Had Paul availed of himself what he truly was and made an effort to be one of the guys once in a while, then there might have been less discontent. How could a not very powerful captain put together by a crew kill the most powerful boss in the United States? Because John Gotti was not that powerful. Simple. It takes honey on the tree to attack. It takes honey on the tree to attract the bears. So in other words, it only takes one man to lead in the revolt. But there are like minds and views. If people have like minds and views, all they're asking for is somebody to lead the revolt. Castellano didn't hesitate to order murders, but he relied on everybody else to do his bidding, and he barked orders like a stepfather. You cannot be a ghost, but you also have to isolate yourself. Take Joey Merlino. And I bring him up because I think that resonates with people because it's a name that is currently relevant. Joey has alleged to be, the boss for 20, 25 years now? Joey doesn't hide. He lives his life. And many people make half-assed comparisons that he's like John Gotti. The men are nothing alike whatsoever. Nothing alike. You won't catch Joey on wiretaps. You will not catch him having a business meeting in broad daylight. In fact, anything they ever got on surveillance-wise is Joey eating dinner, Joey having a beer, Joey smoking a cigar. Normal things. Nothing of consequence. There was a chain of communication between Joey and the hierarchy. And the proof is that he's essentially had the same hierarchy for 20 fucking years. The acting boss situation, they change from time to time. But I would tell you as well that they also use a front boss structure too at times, at least to some extent. Nobody really knows, right? Who's doing what, except for those guys. It always goes back to fear, respect, and loyalty. The entire goal, albeit from the hierarchy stance, is to protect the boss, right? It's to insulate the boss. I think a lot of people have a skewed sense of how this actually works. The purpose is to make money, right? Sure, it propels the family, but you also protect the boss. And I think that's a portion that many people don't understand or don't even consider. There is also a big, wide generation gap too as well. But your main job is to protect the boss. Make your money, but protect the boss. You don't really see Philadelphia's definitely got it. Other crime families, I don't think that's the way it is. So Niccolo Machiavelli has 27 rules for war, and you should too. The mafia has long taken portions from Machiavelli to run their families. If you read the book The Prince, you will see how the mob family structure operates, and there's a lot to take from that book. We're going to talk about the 27 rules, but we're only going to talk about 7 of them today. Okay, number 1, what benefits the enemy harms you, and what benefits you harms the enemy. Simply stated, what's good for the boss, albeit politically or morally within the family, helps him grow. It helps his stock to keep rising. It keeps his respect in check. But if he does something to benefit another boss or another family, it buries you in the ash. Angelo Bruno come to mind? Angelo Bruno immediately comes to my mind. Angelo would have made a fortune in the drug market, but he disavowed his own men to make money doing that. But then he turns around and allows the Gambino crime family to operate in his turf selling drugs for a kickback. The move directly leads to his murder, and this is an example of where he should have put his family and his men first, and he didn't, and he paid the goddamn price for it. Granted, as a boss, you have to be willing to work with others, but you also don't put yourself behind the fucking 8 ball. The worst thing you can do is lose the respect of the men that are underneath of you. The worst thing you could do is starve them and then dangle a steak in front of them. What do you think they're going to do? Maybe you make the right decision, but like I just said, the men underneath you, things look a certain fucking way. Your reputation is more important than how willing you are to spread the wealth. Bottom line. Whoever is more vigilant in observing the designs of the enemy in war and ensures much hardship in training his army will incur fewer dangers and can have a greater hope for victory. And the tenant is easy to understand. Bosses who have struggled, bosses who have led their men into bumpy waters have more experience. They know what other leaders and other bosses are capable of and not capable of. Joe Bonanno knew immediately that Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino were a powerhouse. He knew what they were capable of. So out of habit, he had to join up with Joe Profaci. He had no other choice. He had to counterbalance the power. If left to his own devices, he would have been swallowed up, 100%. Luciano is another good example because he underestimated Vito Genovese. If you know the path and you know what your enemies have done prior, you can predict what they'll do in the future. That's fucking gospel. Number 3, never lead your soldiers into an engagement unless you are assured of their courage. Know that they are without fear, are organized, and never make an attempt unless you see that there is hope for victory. Never throw your family into a war or a struggle if they're soft. If they're weak, you're fucked. If they aren't willing to do what they have to do. If you know that you cannot win a war or the disagreement, just don't even bother. Live to fight another day, and you can apply that to Joe Masseria or Salvatore Maranzano. They both felt that they were the all to end all. They never expected Luciano to be the snake coming out of the asshole. Luciano, like I said, it applies to him. If he didn't have guys who had balls, if he weren't willing to get killed himself and his own men weren't willing to get killed in taking over, then Luciano never would have taken over at all. And the American Mafia never becomes what it becomes. John Gotti, if he didn't have a supporting cast of like-minded people, he didn't have people with balls, he never could have killed Paul Castellano and taken over. The difference is knowing what you can or cannot accomplish, and that's it. Know what you can accomplish, know what you can't. Strength doesn't come in odds. It comes in determination and might. Those are my words. Number 4, it is better to defeat the enemy by hunger than with steel. In such victory, fortune counts more than virtue. And all that means is put a stranglehold. You can cut the head off the snake, but you don't have to use an axe to do it because the snake still has to eat, right? So if you kill everything that the snake eats, it starves to death. In other words, poach the rackets, poach turf. Now that could have bad consequences. But it is better to defeat, because money is the wheel that makes everything move. You take their money, they got nothing. That's how the Italians in Italy are going after gangsters there. They take all the fucking money. Using a gun doesn't solve it all, but if you can strangle them out by cutting off their money, that's what you do. And that's some bullshit. That wouldn't work today, but that worked in the 1920s for sure. Number 5, no proceeding is better than that which you have concealed from the enemy until the time you have executed it. In other words, be 2 steps ahead. Be 3 steps ahead. Know that if you do this, they're going to do one of 3 things and be way ahead of those 3 things. Smart bosses can outcalculate other bosses. It's like the schoolyard bully mentality. You know that little Dougie over there is going to pick on somebody. And you know that if you make eye contact with Dougie, he's going to come over and fuck with you. Then you're going to get your nose busted. And then you're going to be like, why the fuck did I even look at him? Just don't look at him. Same philosophy. Do not understand that hide what you need to do, right? Hide your plans. Be sneaky. Be a fox. Be like a lion and a fox, right? The fox recognizes traps and the lion scares away the wolves. Perfect example. You don't have to conceal shit. You don't have to let them know what you're doing until after it's been done. Just be 3 steps ahead. Be 3 steps ahead of the feds. Number 6, know how to recognize an opportunity in war and take it. It benefits you more than anything else. There's an opportunity for you to do what you got to do. John Gotti, Paul Castellano. It's war. If you have the opportunity, you take it. That's how you win. How do you kill a snake? Chop off its head. Number 7, nature creates few brave men. Industry and training makes many. And all that means is that men can be born to be brave. Men can be tough, but it takes situations to make them that way. A boss doesn't become a great boss without stumbling once or twice. Luciano doesn't become Luciano. If he survives the knife attack, if he doesn't survive that, he's fucking dead. But he took that situation. He learned from it. He learned from the Maranzano shit. He learned from the fucking Masseria shit. Apparently not enough, because he didn't recognize that Genovese. And that's the thing. And that's why I want to apply it to number 7. Luciano knew what Genovese wanted. Luciano had every opportunity to kill Genovese before it happened, and he didn't. Now, we're never going to know why he did it. But even if he recognized it, he hesitated. Do not ever hesitate in this life for nothing. Criminality. This is what I'm talking about. Don't hesitate. Don't hesitate. Hesitation is the mark of a coward. That's the truth. So we are going to leave that off right here for today.